So, welcome to Journey to Freedom, Part 1, Building with Bricks. In case you don't know who I am, my name is Penina Taylor, and I'm really happy to have you with me here today. Now, the purpose of the Passover Haggadah is really to take us on a journey, right? We're told in the Haggadah that we must personally see ourselves as having come out of Egypt. In fact, it says in the Mishnah, Pesachim 10:5, and you're probably going to recognize this from, it's quoted in the Haggadah, right? Every Seder we say this. In every generation, a person must regard himself as though he personally had gone out of Egypt. As it said, and you shall tell your son in that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. Therefore, it is our duty to thank, praise, laud, glorify, exalt, honor, bless, extol, and adore him who performed all these miracles for our ancestors and us. He brought us forth from bondage into freedom, from sorrow into joy, from mourning into festivity, from darkness into great light, and from servitude into redemption. So right there, we have a little bit of a clue of what this journey is supposed to be like, right? Because from servitude to redemption is one part of it, but bondage into freedom, sorrow into joy, mourning into festivity, darkness into great light. Well, year after year, we do the Seder, and unfortunately, many of us don't seem to get much more out of it than a whole lot of work. Yeah, we get joy from the creativity we put into it. We get joy from watching our children light up as we sing songs, reward good questions, and experience the plagues in new and inventive ways. But what about for ourselves? Many of us just put that aside, resting in the knowledge that we're dutifully fulfilling the mitzvah of passing on our genetic memory to the next generation. But the Seder is not only about passing it on to the next generation. As I read to you a minute ago, it's about us going through the process of going on this journey ourselves. We can say that we ourselves came out of Egypt because we're part of a free Jewish people today. And yet, since we don't know anything different, we really can't relate to that, right? So it has been said that we can't truly know what light is unless we have experienced darkness, right? On top of that, Egypt represents so much more than just actual physical slavery. It's a metaphor for a much more insidious form of slavery. And no, I'm not talking about living outside of the land of Israel, not today, but it's a metaphor for this insidious form of slavery that many of us are in bondage to today. And in most cases, we don't even realize it. So what we're going to do over the next 4 weeks is just take a short look at the things in our lives that are enslaving us. And we're going to look at ways to break free from them and to really experience an emotional and spiritual freedom that I believe will set us on a new course in life. Now, I've kept the classes themselves short, only a half an hour each class, because let's face it, this is probably the busiest and most stressful month of the year for us, right? And yet, it's also why we need to take a little time out to take care of ourselves. But just like the old saying, if you think you can't afford to do this, you really can't afford not to do this. So along with the webinar, I'm providing some homework to carry you through the week. I'm not keeping track of who does the exercises and who doesn't or anything like that. That's entirely up to you. But for those of you who want to take what I'm sharing and dig a little deeper, it's there for you. I'm going to be sending out the worksheet by email. So if you want to receive the worksheet, please post your email either below in the chat box or PM it to me. Send it to me by private message, okay? And then once I get your email, I'll be able to send the worksheet to you. Going with this metaphor of slavery, I've called today's class Building with Bricks. Now, When we pray the morning blessings each morning, one of the blessings in the list of things that we thank God for is that he did not make us a slave. In the list of blessings, there are three which the men say, I mean, women say them too, but it's a little different, which the men say that begin with, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who did not make me a," fill in the blank. The three things which men thank God for not making them is a non-Jew, a slave, and a woman. Now, the women thank God for not making them a non-Jew or a slave, but then in place of the thanking him for not making us a woman, because we are women, we thank him for making us according to his will. And that's a whole nother class about learning to appreciate the things that God put into us, the challenges that God gave us, regardless of whether or not we like them, because they are who we are supposed to be, and they're what we need. But anyway, so two of those three, the non-Jew and the woman, are probably the two most controversial prayers in the entire Siddur. They sound so politically incorrect. But when we take a step back, we see that the reason for saying these three things is that all three of these, a non-Jew, a slave, and a woman, are exempt from all or many of the mitzvot. And while it's true that there is no person that is obligated to perform all 613 mitzvot, a non-Jew is not obligated to perform any of them. Now, I'm not including, of course, the seven mitzvot b'nei Noach, the seven universal laws that God gave everybody, regardless of whether or not they're a Jew. But basically, a non-Jew is not obligated to perform any of the mitzvot that God gave the Jewish people. A slave, assuming he's Jewish, is not obligated to perform any of them that his servitude prevents him from performing, which could be all of the mitzvot except for the three for which one must give his life in order not to transgress. And the third one, a woman, while being obligated to many of the mitzvot, is exempt from many of the mitzvot, including all of the time-bound mitzvot. Okay, so you can see why a man might say, "Thank you, God, for not having made me one of these three things," and why they're done in that order, right? Because they're decreasing in or increasing in obligation. Now, the idea that being required to do mitzvot is a good thing. As my husband always says, if he weren't obligated to pray in a minyan each morning, he wouldn't. And while that might not be true for everyone, I would dare say it applies to probably most people. So a slave is not obligated to keep pretty much all of the mitzvot because his servitude prevents him from doing so. The only mitzvot he must keep are the three for which one must give their lives: idolatry, murder, and forbidden sexual relations. So because slavery goes against human nature, human beings, and in fact, I would argue all sentient beings, have a natural drive to be free. So in order to keep a person as a slave, the slave owner has to kind of dehumanize the person so that they can squash that natural drive to be free. Now, just as an aside, do keep in mind that none of these generalities apply to the rules that are given in the Torah of slave ownership as laid out in the Torah and the Talmud. Okay, this is completely different. But when you're talking about regular non-Jewish slave owners, they have to squash that drive to be free in order to be able to keep the slaves. So one of the ways that you squash the drive to be free is by keeping the slaves so busy that they don't have time to even think about freedom, never mind plan it, right? A busy slave only thinks about the here and now and surviving this moment. Maybe you can kind of relate to that already. Remember the story in the book of Shemot in Exodus? Moshe comes to Paro and says to him, "Let my people go." And then what does Paro say, or what does he do? He says basically that they have too much time on their hands. I mean, clearly, since they're thinking about freedom, And so he orders that they not only make bricks, right? But that they have to gather their own straw too. He says, hey, if you're thinking about freedom, you've got too much time on your hands. We've got to make sure that you don't have time to even think about such things. So if you've got extra time making bricks, then get your own straw too. Let's keep you as busy as we can so that you don't have to think about all this nonsense. So when we're enslaved by something, we are so busy that we have no time or energy to think about, never mind plan, for freeing ourselves from what is keeping us busy. So what is it that's keeping us enslaved? Well, each of us spends our time making bricks and then building a wall with it. Depending on what has happened in your life determines what that wall looks like, right? Is it very tall? Is it tall and wide? Maybe not so tall and not so wide, but super thick. Does the wall have a window so that you can see out, but nothing can reach you? Maybe your wall even has a door in it. We all build walls for a variety of reasons. But before I get into why we build walls and what that's doing to us, it's important to establish the difference between a boundary and a wall, because I think that a lot of us confuse the two, and that's why we don't even realize that we've enslaved ourselves in shackles of our own making. Boundaries are good and important. They're healthy. Boundaries delineate what's mine and what's yours. They make the difference between me and you. Boundaries send a message to others that there are lines that they dare not cross. And boundaries inform our actions and help us feel safe. Now, there's an old study which is often cited in regard to boundaries when it comes to parenting. In the study, they observed students playing during recess in a schoolyard which had no fence. And you might expect that the students would make use of the entire yard and maybe even run out past what was officially school property, right? With no clear delineation, anything goes. You might expect that even a couple might get lost or go missing. But in this study, they found that when there was a lack of boundary, the students all played in a very small area close to the school building. The lack of delineated boundaries caused an element of fear of the unknown. However, when they put the students in the same schoolyard but with a fence, the students played all the way out to the fence, even though the fenced area was much larger than the area that the students occupied when there was no fence. Because there was a clear boundary. There was no fear of the unknown. They knew exactly how far they were allowed to go. And not only did they not overstep the boundary, but they joyfully and safely made use of the entire permitted area. So boundaries are good. Boundaries give us guidelines. Boundaries help us to know where we end and someone else begins. But sometimes in an attempt to protect ourselves from injury, from an unwanted intruder, or from any other perceived emotional threat, we build a wall instead of a boundary. The problem is that a wall prevents everything from coming in or out. When you create boundaries, you're exercising your power over yourself and your environment. But when you create a wall, you transfer your power from yourself to the wall. A boundary relies on you to enforce. It lets you keep your power, but a wall does the enforcing for you. Once you've done that, you've lost control of your life and you have made yourself a slave to your wall. Now, because you've convinced yourself, and usually unconsciously, of course, that the wall is absolutely necessary, you occupy yourself with making the bricks and laying the bricks for your wall. That busyness often serves a second positive benefit for you because it keeps you busy. You become so busy making those bricks and laying those bricks that you are conveniently distracted from what really needs attention. But you don't have time to think about freedom, never mind plan for it. So we just keep building and maintaining that wall. But despite what seems like positive benefits from this wall building, there's also a whole lot of negatives. Walls not only prevent bad stuff from coming in, they also prevent good stuff from coming in. While protecting our heart from further injury, we also protect, in other words, keep out, joy and love. On top of that, walls cast a shadow, and a big enough wall will keep out all the light. Once there's no light, you not only can't think about freedom, you can't even see the possibility of freedom. You can't see anything. All right, so what are we supposed to do? Unfortunately, the slavery metaphor continues to work well in describing this situation because we're our own cruel taskmaster. Our fear of being beaten up, of not surviving, puts us into survival mode, even though we're beating ourselves up. Even if our wall has a window or a door, we can't see through it because we're so busy working to avoid the beating that we know is coming that we don't even or can't even look up. All we can do is be in the moment because we are consumed with surviving the moment. But we aren't really in the moment. We're not present. Because to be present is to see the situation for what it is, and that is often too painful. We don't want to see what's really going on. So we keep ourselves busy, laying one brick at a time, and not looking up for fear of what we might see, not pausing from our busyness for fear that we might get beaten up. Now, usually by the time we realize that we've imprisoned ourselves in brick, it's so dark that even contemplating freedom is now an absolute impossibility, no matter how much we want it. But there is hope. It's been said that it's impossible to pull yourself out of a deep hole. You need somebody else who is not in the hole to reach down, or at the very least, send us a rope and pull us up. So I'm going to give you 4 steps, or knots in the rope, if you will, that we can use to get ourselves out of the hole. All right. The 4 steps that we can take to break down those walls and begin to see the possibility of freedom. So the first one is to understand that all of the bricks we build with are made of the same material, and that is fear. We build walls because we're afraid of what might come in. We keep ourselves busy building the walls because we fear what it will take to tear it down. And we're afraid that once we've torn it down, anything could come at us and we won't have a defense. We're afraid of being confronted by whatever caused us to build that wall in the first place. So all bricks are made of fear. Second, we need to acknowledge that the mortar that holds the bricks in place is disbelief. We don't believe it is possible to survive without the wall in place. We don't believe that we are capable of protecting ourselves without that wall. Stop for a second and think about some of the things that you do. And I know it takes more than a second sometimes because we've buried all of this information really deeply inside. But stop and this is also, you should just know that this is part of the exercises that are in the worksheet. So step 1, or the first knot, if you will, was that all bricks are made of fear. Step 2 is that we have to acknowledge that the mortar is disbelief, right? Sometimes we don't believe that we're capable of succeeding as anything other than a slave. After all, we've been a slave for so long. many of us since we were really young in some cases, that we don't know how to be anything else. And in many cases, we subconsciously don't believe that we are worthy of freedom. So that's step 2, that mortar is made of disbelief. The third knot on the rope is that you need to decide that it's worth the risk. Life outside of slavery is not always a picnic. And in some cases, it may even be so difficult that it makes slavery seem preferable. When the children of Israel were in the desert and had nothing to eat but the manna, think back if you remember the story, right? They began to complain, saying, "We remember the fish which we used to eat in Egypt for free, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic." Every time I read that, I say to myself, like, really? Free? The food was free? At what cost? They paid for that food with sweat and blood and their very humanity. But sometimes in the face of adversity, with our memory maybe having been smoothed a little by time, we begin to think that life in slavery was preferable to the difficulties that we are now facing in freedom. Boy, we can apply that to so many different things in our lives. Whether you're talking about becoming a religious Jew, whether you're talking about making Aliyah to Israel, or even things that have nothing to do with Judaism at all, sometimes we think, wow, it was preferable to deal with the difficulties I had than the new ones that I'm having to deal with now. When we're going through the process of tearing down that wall, keep in mind that the end result is worth the risk of pain and difficulty that the process necessarily involves. You think about Americans who came to the United States back when it was really difficult to make that journey because they knew that the risk of dying in the process, and this also applies to people who, you know, started the state of Israel, right? That the risk of dying in the process was worth the promise of freedom, okay? So we have to keep in mind when we're trying to take down the bricks of that wall that we're building or that we've built, that the end result, that freedom, is worth the risk of pain and difficulty that the process necessarily involves. And there's another aspect to that risk factor, right? The wall blocks out everyone and everything, good and bad. You can't keep out heartbreak without also keeping out joy. So building a wall to protect yourself from pain will always guarantee a life of misery. It has to, because you're keeping out the pain, but you're also keeping out the joy. The risk of pain is worth experiencing joy, even if in the short term it doesn't seem like it. So that third knot in the rope was to decide that it's worth the risk. And the fourth knot is something I call put down the shovel. It's always easier to embrace what's familiar, no matter how uncomfortable, than to risk the unknown. Just like the children of Israel who asked Moses, "What, did you bring us out of Egypt just so we could die in the desert?" They were dying in Egypt. But it's almost like a familiar death was preferable to an unknown death. That's the fear talking again. And there goes another brick in the wall. Now, I want you to do a little exercise with me, and the worksheet that I'm going to send you has you going through the exercise a little bit more in depth. But imagine for a second you are a house. I actually want you to take a second and imagine what you would look like if you were a house. What's your ideal house? What's the house that describes you? Okay? Imagine you are a house. You have a front yard and you have a backyard. Your backyard is your past, and your front yard is your future. Now, in the backyard, there's a lot of dog poop, right? We've all had dogs poop in our backyard. Some of us have had big dogs, and some of us have had small dogs, and some of us have had a lot of dogs, and some of us have had very few, but you get the idea. That's the past. And we've all got poop in our past. We've all got poop in that backyard. The front yard, which is your future, is nothing but dirt. No sidewalk, no flowers, nothing. It's like a blank canvas just waiting for your beautiful creative touch. If you've ever bought a house that was built for you, you probably will remember that stage when the house is built, but the yard hasn't been dealt with yet. And so all it is dirt, right? That blank canvas. So you are this house, you have dog poop in the backyard, but your future hasn't been written yet. Your front yard is blank. You can design it any way you want. Now, obviously there are limitations, and we could continue with this metaphor, kind of drawing a parallel between the limitations in life and the limitations. There's some things you just can't put in a front yard, right? But unfortunately, so many of us spend much of our lives with a shovel in our hands, right? Imagine you've got a shovel, digging up the poop from the backyard and flinging it into the front yard. And then when we walk through the poop, over and over and over again, and it ends up stinking up our entire life. We have to learn how to put down the shovel. I mean, of course, it's healthy to acknowledge that we have a backyard and that there's poop in it, but then we have to stop going back there. Just put down the shovel, step out the front door, and create a beautiful front yard. Give your house curb appeal. It's open to your creativity and your beautiful touch. But keep in mind, it takes work, and sometimes it might even seem like it's not worth it. But don't you dare go back to that familiar backyard with all its stink. Put down the shovel and start planting your flowers. Now, you may be thinking, okay, that makes sense, but how do I actually do that? Now, obviously, that's a work that can't be done in the confines of a half-hour video on. So I'm going to give you 2 things to help you take the first step. The first one is what I mentioned before, that I've created this worksheet for you to work through some of these concepts on a more personal level during the course of the coming week. And this way you'll be able to do some work, and next week you'll be better equipped to take the next step that we're going to work on. The second one is that I wanted to let you know that I am a life coach, and I work with people just like you to figure out how to pull down those walls and to begin to heal from emotional trauma so that they can create an intimate and meaningful relationships. Because if you've got a wall, you can't have that, right? And we create relationships. We have relationships with ourselves, with God, and with other people. And so I help people to begin to heal so that they can create intimate and meaningful relationships with themselves, God, and others. So I'm going to be offering a 25% discount to anyone who signs up for coaching with me during the months of March and April. And if you don't live nearby, that's not a problem. I do coaching by Skype or Zoom. So just message me privately for more information. Well, our time is up for today. You all are so awesome. I want to thank you so much for joining me here today. And I look forward to seeing you next week as we continue together on this journey to freedom.